So yes, I am going to be talking again about brain oscillations as building blocks of complex brain activity with a question mark. And to start explaining what brought me to this topic, I would like to explain something different first. The book, or the idea outlined in the book, A New Kind of Science by Stephen Wolfram. Some of you may have read this book. It is already quite old. It came out in 2002. And in this book, Wolfram, a physicist, he makes a bold claim. He basically claims that he found a new explanation for nature and everything that we see in nature. Back then, the book was criticized quite heavily by other scientists, and the ideas could not really establish themselves. But on a more general level, I think Wolfram's conception of nature is a good example of how some people tend to think about nature and the brain, and also brain oscillations. So I'm just quickly going to explain the basic idea. Wolfram had experimented with cellular automata. And the cellular automaton, you can think about this as a very simple program that you could have in your computer, but you could also just implement it on paper. So if you take a piece of squared paper, and some of the squares on that paper are colored black in the top row, and then you iterate through all the squares on the paper from top to bottom, and depending on the pattern of black and white squares in the row above the current one, you either paint or do not paint the current square in black. And whether or not you paint it black follows a set of simple rules like the ones you see here. So when at your current square in the row above, the three neighboring squares are black, then you keep it white. And if the left one is black and the two other ones are white, then you paint it black, and so on. So very simple rules that guide you in painting this piece of paper. And then when you do this for the whole sheet of paper, you get some image or some pattern out. So it might look like this. This is a beautiful pyramid, a recursive, almost fractal pyramid. It looks symmetrical. It looks regular. Nothing too surprising there. But now what Wolfram has found is that there are certain sets of rules. And when you use these sets of rules, then they produce patterns that are not so regular at all. They become quite complex without any apparent reason. So, for example, when you apply these rules shown above, then the pattern that you get out in the end looks like this. So you have a lot of just horizontal black and white stripes. And then in the middle, you have again, a sort of triangle that has on the left some regular pattern, but when you look to the right, the pattern appears to become very complex. So you cannot say it still looks somewhat regular, but there are some quite surprising parts in it. Some parts of it look very irregular and random. So this all of a sudden becomes quite complex or irregular. And you seeing this, you may not think that this has come about by just some very simple rules, but it has. Yeah? This is how it was generated. Okay, now you could say this is just a pattern of black and white squares. It looks complex, but it doesn't do anything. It has no meaning. It has no function. But Wolfram actually explains or interprets his finding in quite a bold way. So the fact that he has found that simple rules can generate complex patterns, he ends up interpreting this like this. I'm going to quote him. Many of the most obvious examples of complexity in biological systems actually have very little to do with adaptation or natural selection. In almost any kind of system, many choices of underlying rules inevitably led to behavior of great complexity. And I think this is a good example of how some people tend to think about nature. And the reason why I'm talking about all of this at the beginning of my talk on brain oscillations is that sometimes you could get the idea that brain oscillations also work in this way, so that that the brain, the cells of the brain, have some simple first principles built in that inevitably will organize themselves to complexity on a systems level and will generate the marvelous function that our brain has without need for design or for purposeful construction of the brain. And I mean, as Christians, at least if we call ourselves creationists of some flavor, we do tend to think about nature as something planned and designed. And it is one of the key arguments of creationism, actually, that the complexity of life could not have come about by chance or in an unguided process, because life works in way too complex ways. And if this idea of Wolfram would be true, or if that would be even possible, then this would obviously be quite a challenge for creationism, right? Because then our key argument might not work anymore, at least not in all cases. Okay, now let's talk about brain oscillations. This was the more general prolegomena. What are brain oscillations? So the research into brain oscillations dates back some 100 years to the German physiologist Hans Berger from Jena. And he did the first, or some of the first, electroencephalography measurements. So electroencephalography is a very common method in neurology and neuroscience until today. It just means measuring people's electrical brain activity with electrodes that you put on the skull. So it's a non-invasive method to measure the brain's activity. And the most notable and most well-known thing that Berger discovered back then was that when people close their eyes, then you see a characteristic prominent pattern in these EEG recordings. So what you see here on the screen are several channels, several electrodes on the skull. And you can see that in the middle part of this recording, something appears to be different, right? So in the beginning, you see some regular pattern. So almost looks like sine waves. Then in the middle, something is different. And then towards the end, you get this sine wave-like pattern again. And it turns out that this is what happens when people close and open their eyes during the recording. So when you close your eyes, then you see this sine wave pattern. And in the middle part, the person has opened her eyes. And you also see quite a few eye blink artifacts. But even without the eye blink artifacts, you could tell that something is different, right? Because not the whole recording is governed anymore by this sine wave pattern. And then towards the end, the person closes her eyes again, and the sine waves come back. So these waves are called alpha waves, and they have been the first brain oscillation that was actually discovered, and they are still quite prominent in research today. So this is what we call the Berger effect, and this was the starting point for brain oscillation research. Okay, let's get into some of the basics of how the brain's electrical activity is generated. I think most of you probably already know this, but I'm just going to recapitulate it. In this figure, you see two exemplary neurons, as you might find them in the brain's gray matter. And each neuron has an electrical potential relative to its surrounding that we call the resting potential. This resting potential is actively maintained by ion transport processes across the cell membrane. It is a negative potential, so the cell's resting potential is negative at about minus 70 millivolts. And then the neuron has dendrites, so these little arms that you see on the left. And over the dendrites, it receives signals from other neurons. And these signals are also electrical potentials. They can be either excitatory, that means the potential is positive. It would shift the cell's potential towards positivity or towards zero. Or these potentials arriving at the cell can be negative, and then they are inhibitory. And these, we call these the postsynaptic potentials that arrive at the cell, and they sum up over time. And the summation is leaky, so it gets lost again. If you wait for too long, this is why we call neurons a leaky integrator. So it integrates the potentials that it receives. And if enough potentials sum up within a short time window, and a certain threshold current is hit, so the threshold is at about negative 55 millivolts. So you have to shift the cell's potential from negative 70 to negative 55. And this is the threshold, and then it will fire. And firing for a neuron usually means it triggers an action potential. So the potential overshoots zero, it becomes positive, and this action potential travels along the axon. So this is this long arm of the neuron on the right. It travels along the axon. It arrives at the terminal buttons, and there releases a neurotransmitter and sends a signal to the next downstream neuron. Okay, so this is the basic mode how most of the cells in our brain communicate with each other. There are other modes, but they don't play such a big role. So the majority of cells in our brain's gray matter communicates in this way. And it turns out that groups of neurons, of neighboring neurons, they tend to synchronize their electrical activity. So they do not just fire independent from each other. So when you measure a group of neighboring neurons with an invasive electrode of some kind, so you go into the tissue and you measure when each cell fires, then you will see that the single cells, they will tend to fire repetitively at a certain frequency. And in the whole neighborhood of neurons, you will see that they don't fire at random times, but that there is synchronization, that they have the tendency to fire around the same time. So, and if you look at this, in the upper panel on the y-axis, you see single neurons, and they would fire around the same time. And then you can measure it on the network level, so not for the single cells, but for several cells at the same time. And then you see the oscillation that is generated by the summed activity of these many synchronized neurons. And again, here this looks a little bit like a sine wave. This is why you can also characterize it in the frequency domain, so you can look at the spectrum. So in this case, we would say we have an oscillation at around 50 hertz. And this particular data here doesn't mean anything. This is just a toy example, but this is the idea how an oscillation in the brain is generated. Now comes the even more interesting part. So the question that arises inevitably is, why do these cells all fire around the same time? So is there some common drive, that some common pacemaker that tells them to fire at the same time, to synchronize their firing, to generate the oscillation? How does this work? And the prevailing model in neuroscience says that there is no common pacemaker, but that these cells can organize themselves to oscillate. I'm going to show this in a moment. First, I'm going to show how the oscillation of a single cell can come about. So even a single cell does not need an oscillatory input in order to oscillate. There is a certain design how neurons can be connected to each other that allows them to generate oscillations by themselves. And the key to understanding is that there are excitatory and inhibitory neurons in the brain. So there's a certain type of neurons that we call inhibitory that can inhibit another cell's activity and another cell's firing. And it turns out that when they are connected in loops. So when excitatory neurons are connected to inhibitory neurons, such that the inhibitory neuron gets a copy of the excitatory cell's input, then they build a loop. This can be a feedback or a feed-forward loop. And the interplay of excitation and inhibition can then generate a regular oscillation. And this is relatively independent from how the input looks. So here on the right, you see this is just simulated data, but this is how it works in principle. So if you have a cell, so this would be an astrocyte with some apical dendrites. So this would be this could be a cortical cell at the outer layer of the cortex. And normally it would fire in this burst-like way, because maybe this is the type of input that it gets, right? So it would fire 4 or 5 times, then there's a break, and then it would fire again 4 or 5 times. And then in the bottom panel, you add an inhibitory feedback to the model. And even though the neuron still gets the same inputs, all of a sudden it has turned this burst firing into oscillatory firing. And there are several quite elaborate mathematical models to explain this. I'm not going into any depth here. So for example, there is the model of pulse-coupled oscillators, of thunder-pole oscillators, that can explain this in more detail. This is not exclusive to neurons. You can also generate similar patterns with electrical circuits or mechanically. But the idea is that whenever you have a feedback loop where excitation and inhibition are balanced in a certain way, they can generate an oscillation without need for oscillatory input per se. So this is what a single cell is capable of doing. But it becomes even more interesting because it turns out that single cells that oscillate can synchronize with each other, right? This is what we've just seen. And also this synchronization of single oscillators is not dependent on a common pacemaker, on a common drive that tells them to synchronize. But this is also something that the oscillators can, in principle, do autonomously. And this idea, it originally came from, did not come from neuroscience. So the original observation comes from fireflies. There is a group of fireflies living in Southeast Asia. And in the summer, in the evening, when you observe these fireflies, you will see that their flashing becomes synchronized. So you see thousands of fireflies and they all flash at the same pace. And people were fascinated by this observation for a long time. So all the way back in 1935, this matter was already discussed. This observation in principle that oscillators can synchronize each other is even older. So even back in the 17th century, Christian Huygens described that clocks hanging on the same wall can synchronize their pendulums. But it took quite a while. It took until 1990 before Mirolo and Strogatz came up with a mathematical model to describe this. And this model is actually very simple. So all it says is, when you have a group of oscillators, they will synchronize each other inevitably when they are able to observe their neighbors. So every oscillator can observe his neighbors, so the other oscillators in the group. And then they have you can think of them as having an internal tuning curve. So they have some property that builds up. And at some point, when a certain threshold is hit, then the oscillator fires, whatever firing means. So for the firefly, it would mean flashing. For the neuron, it would mean action potential. But there is some build up of the oscillators firing. And then when you assume that every oscillator observes his neighbors, and whenever one of the neighbors fires, then it gets a shift on its curve. It gets shifted by a certain amount forward on its own activation curve. This is called epsilon in the model. So the oscillator observes his neighbor, the neighbor fires, and then the oscillator shifts itself by epsilon, or the maximum is 1 because at 1 it fires and gets reset to 0. And this simple model is enough to have a group of oscillators inevitably synchronize each other. So they will always end up in synchrony. So we have seen that neurons in principle can generate oscillatory firing on the cellular level autonomously, and several oscillators can generate a synchronized oscillation also autonomously without an external drive. But we can still move up one level and look at this at the whole, for example, at the whole brain level or for a whole area of the brain. And we still see a pattern. So oscillatory spectra organized into a global pattern. And so when you look at the figure on the left, this would be a spectral representation of oscillations, right? So you have oscillations of different frequencies that you measure across the brain. So this could be a cellular, so an invasive recording of brain tissue, could also be electroencephalography, magnetoencephalography, it doesn't matter. You have some measurement of the oscillatory activity of the brain. And you characterize the different frequencies, and for each frequency you can quantify how strong the power, so how strong the oscillation is at this moment. And what you will always see in brains, in humans, animals, is this pattern. So when you plot it on a double logarithmic scale, then the spectrum will look like a linear decline over frequencies. So the slower frequencies are strongest, and the higher you go on the spectrum, the weaker the power becomes. And then above this linear decay, you still have peaks. So this is then called the periodic and aperiodic part of the spectrum. That's a detail that is not so important right now. But the point is that the power of different oscillations is organized on a global scale, brain-wide. And this shape of spectrum, where you have a linear decay on a double logarithmic scale, this is called a power law. And the power law turns out to represent an organization mode of a system that is called a critical state dynamics. So this is a concept coming from physics that is, again, not restricted to brains. You can see it in different points, at different points in nature. So for example, here if you look at the figure on the right, this is an example for a lattice of iron atoms and their magnetization properties. So you have the spins of single atoms, and when spins of iron atoms look into the same direction, then the piece of iron gets magnetized. And it turns out that depending on the temperature, of course, it gets the ordering of the spins gets stronger or weaker. So at a very low temperature, the spins tend to be very ordered or look into the same direction. As the temperature gets higher, it gets more chaotic. And there is a certain point, certain middle ground of temperature in this case, where the ordering of the spins becomes complex. So it is at the phase transition between order and chaos. And at this transition between order and chaos is where complexity happens. And this is called the critical state, the state between order and chaos. And it turns out that this state is optimal in some respects. So for example, if you look at correlations over time, so you pick two random atoms in this lattice and you see how their spins are correlated over time, then this correlation will be maximized at the critical state. Or also information propagation. So when you disturb this field at some point, and you want to see how far this disturbance or this interference can travel in the lattice, then this information transfer property is also maximized at the critical state. So this state appears to be optimal in some ways in terms of stability, in terms of information efficacy. And apparently the brain also is in this state. At least this is what this power law spectrum suggests. Yeah, so critical properties of brain oscillations are still an open area of research, and it's also quite a complex area, so it is difficult to explain this in full detail in such short time. But let me just add that even though it is still under debate, recent research appears to show that critical dynamics play a role in the brain and that they can in fact organize themselves. So there was this recent study by Ma and colleagues who have shown that when you disturb brain areas, this was in the visual cortex in this case, when you disturb the critical state balance, then it will return into this state. So a disturbed brain system will return to the critical state dynamic. So there seems to be a self-organization component to this. But again, I'm not fully competent to go into the details because the models get quite involved mathematically there. Okay, so I have explained very briefly now how in a way you can think of the whole brain's activity as coming from rather simple first principles. So neurons can turn firing into oscillations. The oscillators can turn oscillations into synchronization, and the whole brain as a system can turn these synchronized oscillations into critical state dynamics. And that almost sounds like one of Stephen Wolfram's cellular automata, right, that I've shown in the beginning. So you start with something simple, and then in a self-organized way, you end up with something very complex. And again, if that were the case, it might be challenging for Christian creationism because we believe that nature doesn't work this way. So we believe that it is designed. And now physics appears to say, okay, complexity can organize itself. And apparently it also happens in the brain to some extent. Still, I think that this does not mean that we can explain complex brain activity from simple first principles for a number of reasons. So first of all, I think this is not new for any one of you. Complexity does not imply function, right? So when we see something complex, it does not mean that it does anything meaningful. This is still one step further. And so far, we haven't really seen these brain oscillations do anything meaningful, right? So when they oscillate and synchronize themselves and organize into critical state dynamics, this is nice, but it is still just math. So we have not seen this brain do anything meaningful like language, memory, emotion. So yeah, this is, I think, one point that is important to keep in mind. Complexity does not imply function. And also, even if we could explain brain oscillations all the way bottom up from first principles, they are still not a sufficient model to understand the brain. So I found it funny that just, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, this paper came out, Neural Oscillations are a start toward understanding brain activity rather than the end. And now for the rest of my talk, I want to show you 2 examples why this is the case, why neural oscillations are insufficient for understanding brain activity. The first example that I want to show you is this actually very funny paper. So I had some good laughs reading this. It comes from Konrad Körding, University of Pennsylvania, I think, of Chicago. And what he has done is he took a microprocessor and tried to understand the way the microprocessor works using neuroscientific methods. And the beauty of this is that for a microprocessor, you actually know the ground truth, right? So you understand how it works on every level. It is complex, but still humans are capable of understanding this. And then he applied different methods that neuroscientists would apply. So for example, you might know that neuroscientists like to do lesion studies. So in the early days of neuroscience, this played an important role. So when you find that a certain brain area is lesioned, and then you find that the patient with this lesion has lost a certain function, then you conclude that this brain area is important for this particular function. And he did this with the microprocessor. So he played 3 games on that microprocessor: PK, PF, and SI. This is Donkey Kong, Pitfall, and Space Invaders. And then he lesioned, so he destroyed single transistors on the microprocessor. And he found that there's a certain group of microprocessors that when you destroy those, then Donkey Kong will not run anymore. And then there are other distinct transistors, and when you destroy those, then Pitfall will not work anymore. But it would be obviously wrong to think of those transistors as the Donkey Kong transistors, right? So a microprocessor does not have a Donkey Kong area. You can conclude that these transistors apparently play a role. When you want to play Donkey Kong, then apparently you need those transistors, because when the game does not run anymore, when you destroy them, then they probably play a role. But still, it would be wrong to think about the blue ones as the Donkey Kong transistors. And he also studied oscillatory activity of the single transistors. And for some transistors, he found something surprisingly similar to brain oscillations. He even found power laws and critical state dynamics. But still, he applied a few other methods, connectivity and so on. But none of those methods was able to recreate this map on the right that represents the ground truth. So this is how the microprocessor is actually organized. And by studying oscillations and by studying lesions, you can uncover certain aspects of which areas and which transistors are important, but you are far away from understanding the actual code that it runs on and the actual way it processes information. So this is one example. So we cannot understand microprocessors using neuroscientific methods. And so chances are it is also quite difficult to fully understand brain functions using those methods. The second example that I would like to show you is this recent study that got quite a bit of attention in the media, because this study has shown that neurons themselves, single neurons, are also more complex than we previously thought. So I've explained to you in the beginning that we usually think of a neuron as a leaky integrator. So it just takes inputs, and when inputs sum up and when there is enough summed up input, then the neuron fires. So it just integrates information that it receives. And this study, published last year, has shown that there is at least one type of neurons that can do more complex logical operations. So it can do an exclusive OR. What that means is, you can think about it as, when I get an input at dendrite A, then I will fire. When I get an input at dendrite B, then I will also fire. But if I get inputs at both dendrite A and B, then I will not fire. This is a logical operation that is more complex and that you cannot explain with the classical leaky integrator model. So what that means is that the firing of neurons and the firing patterns of neurons themselves might bear more meaning than we previously thought. And this is another argument why just understanding oscillations, or just understanding at which pace it oscillates, is very insufficient for understanding how it actually works and processes information. Nonetheless, oscillations are useful. Okay, oscillations are a useful model for understanding a number of things happening in the brain. So, for example, for Parkinson patients, so when you record brain activity from Parkinson patients, then you see pathological oscillations. So you will see that they have a too strong oscillation in the beta band. Beta means around 20 hertz. And this represents a pathological hypersynchronization between the basal ganglia and the motor cortex. And you can also trace back this activity, and you can make a connection to the tremor. So it is also correlated with the tremor. And in this case, the oscillation has actual meaning. It represents the pathological physiology of the basal ganglia. Or if you look at Zanos et al. From 2018, they have shown that when you take a group of neurons that oscillate at a certain frequency and you give a stimulation, so just electrical current into this population, then it makes a difference at which phase of the oscillatory cycle you stimulate. So you will see that the group of neurons behaves in a different way and responds to inputs in a different way afterwards, depending on whether you stimulated it at the peak or the trough of the ongoing oscillation. Or third example, for memory function, you can find some very interesting properties of oscillation. So for memory encoding, it is an important, it seems to be an important working mode of the brain that we have this oscillation called hippocampal theta. So this is a slow oscillation in the hippocampus. And it is phase coupled with a faster oscillation called frontal gamma. So this happens in the prefrontal cortex. And the synchronization between these two oscillators appears to represent memory encoding. And it actually makes then a difference at which phase of the oscillation you would give new information and so on. So what I want to say with this is we can use oscillations to get some actually meaningful insights about the brain. But the examples that I've shown before make clear that this is just one way to look at the brain. And just by understanding oscillations, we haven't understood the whole thing. So we probably have to think about oscillations more as a clock, as the brain's clock. But just by understanding the clock, I have not yet understood what happens during each clock cycle. Okay, this is all from my side. So I will be happy to take your questions and comments.